The most excruciating breaking is the one done in complete silence. Every piece of your body hits the floor in the loudest way, yet no one hears the shattering. No one hears because you have perfected the cleanup behind closed doors, as was required. And by the time someone looked into your eyes, not a trace of your broken soul remained. I was born into darkness. I was born into the dark, cataclysmic web of incest and sex trafficking, in which I was the victim and my parents were my perpetrators. Although no words can adequately describe what I went through, how I felt, the emotional toll it took, the enormity of pain that resides deep within, or the monumental effort it has taken to function in this world. My intent in telling my story is to bring awareness to these all too common nefarious acts and to ultimately bring hope and healing to those who have suffered the horror of these types of sexual violence. Now, I cannot remember a time in my young life when the horror of sexual violence was not in my life continuously. It was a nightly ritual that progressively worsened until by the time I was approximately 4 years of age, my parents began selling me to other men who would come to our home to engage in sexual acts with me. Or more specifically, they sold me to men who would pay to repeatedly rape me in the sexual torture room that was our basement. It was here that my parents video recorded all of these assaults on my body, being, and soul. It was here that men paid extra to take these videos home to reminisce on their vile assaults of me. Here, I was photographed in naked and sexualized positions as I grew into a woman. Here, I was left alone, naked, bleeding, and screaming in pain for years as I cried out to God in the darkness to save me. As I grew into adolescence, my parents sold me to men who did international business with my father. Each month, men paid my parents to send me with them on their private jets. When we arrived at our destination, I was forced to be a sexual slave to the man or men who had purchased their time with me. When I was so viciously abused, I felt this cleaving in my soul, and as if my very being had split. My abusers shattered my body, mind, and soul into shards for decades. My very being was destroyed by the actions of my abusers. Because of my abusers, I had difficulty trusting and entering into intimate relationships. Because of my abusers, I continuously questioned my judgment, my intelligence, my competence, my sexuality, my mental health, my sanity, my career choices, my relationships, my safety, my self-esteem, my courage, my confidence, my perseverance, my resilience, my faith, my relationship with God, my genuine spirit, my hardworking nature, my dedication, my sense of purpose, and my dignity. And I felt as if I was serving a life sentence because of this anguish of my soul. So before I go on to further tell you my story, I want to first discuss a bit about the impact of trauma on the brain, and then we'll move forward. So I went to graduate school to obtain my PhD in neuroscience, not only because I had always been fascinated by the brain, but more importantly, so that I could find the molecular weight of suffering. You see, all molecules have a certain molecular weight. I thought that I would be able to identify a molecule or a group of molecules that cause my suffering and find a way to attenuate their impact and therefore relieve my pain. However, I quickly and very unfortunately learned that the brain does not work quite so simply, as we will soon see. So before discussing the impact of trauma on brain function, I will first discuss the structures in the brain that are involved in trauma responses. And these include the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the thalamus. Now, the prefrontal cortex is our thinking or rational brain. So to really bring this home, I invite you to take a moment right now and recall when you last did a crossword puzzle or when you last talked through your feelings in a rational manner to try to make meaning of what you felt. When you did this, you used your prefrontal cortex. The thalamus is an ovoid mass within the brain that acts as a relay center or an air traffic controller, and this will be further explained a little bit later. So what it does, it sends signals received from our five senses to various regions within the brain, which will again be further explained in subsequent slides. Now, the amygdala is the seat of fear, as it mediates fear responses. Now, again, I invite you to take a moment right now and recall a time when you were paralyzed in fear or feeling very anxious, for example, about taking an exam or driving in a car or anything else that might make you afraid. When this happened, your amygdala was in control of your brain. Now, the hippocampus, which is also involved in the trauma response, is involved in learning and memory, emotional memory specifically. The hippocampus temporarily stores memories and sends them to regions within the cortex for final storage or consolidation over time. However, when we as individuals experience a traumatic event, the memories and feelings associated with this event are stored within the hippocampus and are not sent to the cortex. Now, this will become important when we talk about the brain function further subsequently. Now, before moving on, I wanted to just discuss the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system not only controls our body's internal organs, it also plays a significant role in emotional and physiological responses to stress and to trauma. The ANS is composed of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with the fight or flight response. And this is initiated by a release of cortisol and adrenaline throughout the bloodstream. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system puts the brakes on the sympathetic nervous system. And so the body stops relieving stress chemicals and we become more relaxed. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are meant to work in a rhythmic alternation that support healthy digestion, sleep, and immune system function. However, chronic stress and unresolved trauma can interfere with the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, impacting physical and emotional health. Now, the fight, flight, freeze response can show up in many typical life situations, including, but not limited to, slamming on the brakes when the car in front of you suddenly stops, encountering a growling dog while being afraid of dogs while walking outside, jumping out of the way of an oncoming vehicle, or feeling unsafe while walking down the street alone at night. However, and those of us who carry around unresolved trauma, this stress response can become constitutively active, that means always on, and adversely impact physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So let's take a closer look at how this happens. So before going into fear responses, I just want to first take a look at the sequence of neural events that occur when the brain responds to and interprets common environmental stimuli, such as a tree. So when we see a tree, input from our sense organs, such as our eye, is sent to the thalamus. The thalamus receives the signals sent from our sense organs and in turn acts as an air traffic controller to route signals where they need to go. When interpreting this non-stressful stimuli of a tree, the thalamus directs the impulse or signal to the cortex. In this case, it's the occipital lobe of the cortex for processing. And once the cortex receives the signal from the thalamus, it thinks about the impulse and makes sense of it. It says, aha, this is a tree, and this means I should not be afraid. Also, the tree to me symbolizes strength and reminds me to root myself to the ground. The cortex then sends this information to the amygdala. The amygdala receives these signals and in response releases neuropeptides or neurohormones, which are then sent to other areas of the brain, including the hippocampus, to alert the brain that all is okay. In contrast, when we experience a threat, the thalamus reacts to this threat and short circuits the cortex. That means that the thalamus does not send the signal to the cortex. Rather, the thalamus sends the signal directly to the amygdala, which is, as we said, the seat of fear, rather than directing it to the cortex or the thinking brain for analysis. When the amygdala receives the signal and it hasn't been processed by the cortex, the amygdala can only react based on its previously stored memories and patterns, which for individuals who have experienced trauma often relates to the trauma itself and our feelings and sensations associated with it. Thus, the amygdala then sends a distress signal and activates the autonomic sympathetic nervous system, triggering the fight, flight, freeze response, as discussed previously. Now, let's take a closer look at these regions. So there are 3 regions within the brain: the threat and fear detection and emotional regulation regions, which contain some of the structures that we just discussed. Now, within each of these regions, there is an ongoing conversation. In fact, these regions often compete to control our behavioral response. And so when these factions are in balance, we actually feel balanced. For example, activation of the prefrontal cortex, which is shown in green, puts the clamp or inhibits the emotional and threat detection centers, shown in red and yellow, respectively. And those who have not experienced significant trauma, or when someone is just having a great day and all feels well. Conversely, trauma of any kind changes the brain at the molecular, cellular, and structural level. Recent data suggests that structures within these 3 regions just discussed are more likely to become reshaped or rewired upon exposure to traumatic events, and subsequently mediate post-trauma responses. So in those of us who have experienced trauma, regions within the prefrontal cortex, shown in green, become physically smaller and are gradually unable to connect as strongly with the brain's fear and threat detection centers. Thereby, the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient at inhibiting fear and threat detection function. In addition, individuals who have experienced trauma, the seat of fear, or the amygdala, located in the fear detection system, becomes physically enlarged or greater volume and develops stronger connections back to the threat detection center as well as to the hippocampus. Recall that unprocessed memories, traumatic memories, are stored in the hippocampus. When the amygdala sends fear signals to the hippocampus in response to an environmental trigger that is threatening, this can lead to a flooding of feelings and our memories associated with the previous traumas, and the fight, flight, freeze response ensues, as discussed. This is one of the primary reasons why those of us who have unprocessed trauma constantly feel on edge and emotionally reactive, because our brains are actually different. For example, even when I was no longer being abused, I felt as if my very being had been destroyed by the actions of my abusers. I experienced violent, intrusive memories that often came without apparent reason and at almost every moment in response to the smallest things. I also felt suicidal and convulsed in tears daily, and I clung to anything I could to keep myself alive. In addition to the above factors, the brain itself has an inherent negativity bias. So what does this mean? So as humans, whether we have experienced severe trauma or not, we all tend to remember negative experiences better than positive ones, recall insults better than praise, react more strongly to negative stimuli, think about negative things more frequently than positive things, and respond more strongly to negative events than to equally positive events. So this is part of the reason that survivors of trauma have such a difficulty healing. This negativity bias keeps us as survivors perpetually stuck in a cycle of shame, isolation, and depression. So even when I was no longer being abused, I felt as if my very being had been destroyed by the actions of my abusers, and I did not know how to function. What I didn't know was that my brain was injured. And there are many responses to trauma. And although responses to trauma can vary significantly from person to person, trauma can impact an individual emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Trauma has a significant emotional impact and can lead to denial and our feelings of sadness, anger, fear, terror. In addition, we as trauma survivors may avoid situations that may remind us of our trauma and or experience intrusive memories. Together, this cycle of emotions can cause us to feel suicidal, experience nightmares or an inability to sleep, have difficulty relating and trusting to others. And suicidal feelings are a common experience for those of us trauma survivors who suffer from PTSD. In fact, individuals with PTSD have an approximate 80% increase in suicide risk. So this is why it's so important that we need to learn how to overcome this. For me, even when the abuse was no longer occurring, I continued to experience pain, and I walked in blackness that was beyond what words can describe. Surreal terror consumed me at all times. Suicidal thoughts haunted my body, being and soul. The wounded little girl inside of me, the metaphoric wounded little girl inside of me, screamed for a mommy. I was unable to trust others. I was unable to trust myself. I felt trapped, isolated, alone, and separate. In addition to its emotional impact, trauma impacts us physically. For example, my past trauma has caused me to endure types of chronic physical pain. Unresolved trauma has also been linked to the development of pulmonary disorders, neurological illnesses, cardiovascular disorders, gastrointestinal disorders, liver diseases, cancer, obesity, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, as well as sexually transmitted infections. Further, unresolved trauma has a devastating psychological impact. Trauma has been linked to the development of major depressive disorder, anxiety and panic disorders, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorders, and addictive disorders, such as substance abuse and or eating disorders. Now, I personally have very resistant treatment-resistant depression and complex PTSD, and it's a challenge every day. The emotional, physical, and psychological consequences of trauma, in addition to the trauma itself, can create deep-rooted feelings of shame in survivors. And shame damages self-image in a way that no other emotion can. As survivors, our struggle to regulate our emotions secondary to our trauma, including fear, anger, sadness, terror, as well as avoidance of triggering situations and intrusive memories, can cause us to feel deeply flawed, weak, or not good enough. Further, trauma-induced physical and or psychological disorders have an additive effect and can potentiate our feelings of unworthiness, leading to increased feelings of shame and despair. In fact, shame can become self-perpetuating and exacerbate the detrimental impact of the trauma itself. This self-perpetuating cycle of shame impacts all areas of survivors' lives, disrupting their ability to live full, stable, and healthy lives, and inhibiting their ability to recover and to heal. We as survivors often think we are unworthy. This distorted thought leads us to believe we are unworthy. And these thoughts and feelings and behaviors propagate feelings of unworthiness and shame that leave us feeling as if we were stuck in a vicious cycle of isolation and despair and trapped in shame that we cannot get out of. While no one is immune to feeling shame, survivors of the types of sexual violence that I endured are more likely to experience the surreptitious effects of shame, because these types of traumas are extremely dehumanizing and humiliating. And when seeking help, survivors are often not believed or are pathologized by the very experts trained to help them. The perfect recipe for shame to form and to grow. For me, shame impacted all areas of my life, whether when the abuse was going on and then long after the abuse ended. It made me feel trapped in a tornadic blackness of anxiety, panic, and despair. It disrupted my ability to live a full, stable, and healthy life, and inhibited my ability to heal. I thought I was unworthy. I believed I was unworthy. And when I was left and I was left alone fighting to hold on to life. For years, actually for decades, I truly believed that I wore a metaphoric scarlet letter S for slut on my shirt for all to see. And I truly believed that everyone viewed me as a slut when they saw me walking down the street. So before we proceed, let's take a moment to reflect on our own levels of shame right now. So to do that, I invite you to take out a piece of paper, or if you are comfortable enough, write in the chat box and answer the following questions. How does shame show up in your life? What thoughts or sensations accompany shame? How does shame feel in your body? How is shame manifested in your behaviors? And I'll just take a few seconds of silence to allow people to finish thinking or writing. So after you've taken a few moments to write, observe how you feel without judgment. Now take a few moments to reflect on how the shame you carried or still carry, keeps you victimized by your previous life experiences. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just not have that? So we can feel positive about ourselves and not feel so weighed down by these hidden albatrosses that impact our very soul. The reason it is so important to identify shame is because when we as trauma survivors are caught in shame cycles, our bodies are constantly on alert, as if they were when we experienced a trauma. Because we are in a continuous hypervigilant state, we are more likely to react to everyday situations or triggers in ways that are out of proportion to or incongruent with our current reality. For example, we may experience panic or tirades of anger simply because we forgot to pick up an ingredient for our lasagna recipe. In fact, research suggests that shame may not only maintain, but exacerbate PTSD by increasing the severity and duration of fear over and above the impact of the actual trauma. Studies report that intrusive memories of traumatic experiences have been found to be accompanied more often by feelings of shame than by feelings of fear, horror, or helplessness. And other data indicate that shame may mediate the relationship between PTSD symptom severity and suicidal ideation. So why does this happen? So simply put, shame changes our brain. When shame intrudes, we become hijacked by our threat detection and fear detection systems, the very systems in our brain that are activated when we are actually attacked. So in response to shame, our prefrontal cortex, or our thinking brain, goes offline and gives way to fight, flight, freeze responses. Our threat detection and fear detection systems dominate when we experience shame because our brain does not know the difference between an actual threat or a perceived emotional threat. Thus, shame is perceived by the brain as a threat, and it reacts as if it was being attacked. So for me, shame caused me to feel as if I was continuously experiencing overwhelming emotional thoughts such as fear, panic, distress, depression, which were out of measure or out of proportion with my current reality. Now, why did it do this? Because shame overactivates our threat and fear detection systems and hijacks the ability of the cortex, or our rational mind, to process information, leading to emotional responses that are immediate, overwhelming, and out of proportion with the actual stimulus. And in fact, Daniel Goleman, in his book Emotional Intelligence, referred to this phenomenon as an amygdala or emotional hijack, meaning that the amygdala or your limbic system overtakes your brain and your cortex is not able to think. So the most challenging part about shame is that once it descends, it can be very hard to break out of because shame changes the brain in insidious ways. It rewires our neural connections. It enhances the brain's inherent negativity bias. And it keeps individuals, such as myself, perpetually stuck in a cycle of isolation, depression, and despair. So healing trauma of any kind involves a balance of attending to the wounds of the past while living in the present. And simply attending to the demands of daily living itself can feel insurmountable at times. For example, going to the store to buy groceries, handling stress at work, raising children, or relating to your spouse can feel more than overwhelming when you are flooded with anxiety or shut down in shame. And while evidence-based approaches such as trauma-informed therapy, EMDR, or dialectic behavioral therapy, and others have been shown to help individuals heal, survivors of severe trauma often require more support than their once or twice weekly therapy session. Thus, having tactics or tools in your pocket that help you to remain mindful and grounded between sessions is essential to obtaining empowerment and reclaiming your life. But how can we as trauma survivors choose to become self-empowered and tap into our inner self-worth? The answer is by taking purposeful action steps to heal. The tactics that I have used to transform my pain into power fall into the following buckets or steps that are shown on this slide here. And they include, one, we first need to understand the neurobiological basis of trauma, because if we don't understand that, we won't know what's going on with our bodies. Two, identifying and using strength to cultivate the courage necessary to heal. Three, using containment strategies so that we can tolerate and integrate when traumatic memories spontaneously erupt. Four, understanding the importance of speaking your truth and actually speaking it, so breaking silence. Five, closing the door on suicide and holding on to the permanence of hope. Six, trading shame for self-compassion. Seven, reparenting our wounded inner child and victimized parts. Eight, placing blame on the abuser or the abusers rather than blaming oneself. 9, taking steps to trust yourself and others again. And finally, embrace empowerment. By practicing tactics within each of these buckets regularly, I was able to break free from trauma bonds and release the terror of the past. So to illustrate how I did this, today I will focus on tactics to overcome shame. As previously discussed, the consequences of any traumatic event, in addition to the event itself, can create deep-rooted feelings of shame. According to sociologist Brene Brown, shame thrives and grows exponentially in a culture of secrecy, silence, and judgment, whereas empathy and kindness eradicate shame. Self-compassion has a similar effect on shame, as if receiving empathy from another. Indeed, self-compassion can be considered an antidote to shame, because it deactivates our threat systems and activates our brain's soothing system. Now, self-compassion has been shown to be a powerful resource that we can access at any moment of struggle, including when we experience shame. Dr. Kristen Neff has formally defined self-compassion as a balance between increased positive and decreased negative self-responding in times of personal struggle. Indeed, compassion itself literally means to suffer with and consists of self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. In fact, Judith Herman, a pioneer of trauma research and therapy, placed self-compassion at the heart of trauma recovery by stating that in order to recover from trauma, one must overcome barriers to shame and secrecy, make the intolerable tolerable, and grieve the past, as well as come to new perspectives with a more compassionate view of oneself in the present. When I read this years ago, I thought, how can I possibly do that? How can I trade shame for self-compassion? The answer I learned slowly and painfully. Now, before we move on, let's consider this list of positive beliefs as presented on the slide. So the positive beliefs are: I am lovable, I am important, I am worthy, I survived, I am strong, I am capable, I belong, I am safe now. I invite you to choose from this list or identify any other positive statement that feels most relevant to your healing process or to your present situation. And imagine that you can travel back in time and have a conversation with, for example, the younger version of yourself who was traumatized and shamed. And now you want to metaphorically or metaphysically tell this younger individual what you now know. You might say something like, I know you think you'll always feel this sad or this bad, but I want to let you know that you will survive and that you are safe now because I'm going to take you out of this situation. And even if you don't know it, you are very important and worthy of love. So take your time to anchor in your positive beliefs about yourself and consider how this might help you obtain personal empowerment. When we stop and intentionally act with self-kindness, like we did in this exercise, we learn to nurture ourselves when life is difficult and offer ourselves support and encouragement, as well as generate positive emotions of love and care that potentiate soothing and further the healing process. So neurobiologically, self-compassion actually deactivates our threat and fear detection systems and activates our self-soothing system, in part by decreasing levels of stress hormones, which were cortisol and adrenaline, and increasing levels of feel-good neuropeptides, such as oxytocin and endogenous opiates, thus keeping the brain in a sort of dynamic equilibrium. So to find my way out of shame, I had to engender the courage to paradoxically lean into or embrace the dark abyss of my shame and look for the light within. It took time and very hard work and continues to be a constant journey. You see, the light of hope is always there. It just tends to be quieter and harder to find within the cacophonous darkness. Indeed, much of the beauty of light owes its existence to the dark. So to overcome shame, I use the tactics presented on this slide. As I learned how I experienced shame, I slowly began to be with this painful emotion with self-compassion and to respond to myself with the same care that I would give anyone else suffering in the same way. For example, I actually emailed myself affirmations and statements of love and care to remind myself that, and my metaphoric wounded little girl, that I was safe and I was not alone. Amidst flashbacks and suicidal ideations, I wrote a list of at least 10 gratitudes daily, no matter how badly I felt, and I still do. And some days gratitudes may consist of, I am so grateful that I am still breathing. You see, gratitude opened myself up for a more positive, fulfilling existence and increased positive vibrations within my soul, which combat that negativity bias in my brain to help myself pave the way to a better life. And it can do this for us all. I also daily write down the highlights of my day or the good things that happen so that I can continue to learn to take in the good and again, combat that negativity bias that exists within us all. I practice common humanity and mindfulness by doing yoga or meditation. When I lost my words in the midst of panic attacks and flashbacks, I used symbols, one of which was a sunflower, to remind myself to look to the light within and that there was still light. I also practiced and still do practice positively reframing negative self-talk, as it is always there. So as I embraced my negative emotions, I learned to generate positive emotions. And I slowly rewired my brain and learned how to be with the emotional wounds of the past that fed my shame. Throughout my journey, I have learned that the core belief that I am enough comes only when I live inside my story with compassion. And this is true for us all. As a child, my heart and soul were shattered. As an adult, I have realized that there is a crack in everything. And that is often how the light gets in. So I urge you today to befriend your dark and shattered parts so that you can embrace the infinite power of your life. I urge you to be brave enough to see the light and to be the light. I also ask that, as Theodore Roosevelt originally said, dare greatly. Dare greatly by choosing to heal. Dare greatly by choosing the light of hope, no matter how dark you feel inside. Dare greatly by communicating to survivors that they are not alone. Dare greatly by sitting with the broken. Dare greatly by taking steps to eradicate our societal culture of rape, incest, and trafficking. Dare greatly by remembering that we are all connected to one another by a force that is greater than ourselves. And that force is one grounded in love and compassion. Thank you so much.